The closer one gets, the more the outer cordon asserts itself. Motion detecting pan tilt zoom cameras peer at the Chennai pavement, flanked by walls so thick they'd stop a charging elephant. This isn't the military site or a glass and steel BPO campus. This is India's brisk march into the brave new AI world. It's where your data is parked. Data centers are built like fortresses with vault like layers of security. Entry is strictly by employment or invitation. Inside, access cards and facial recognition sensors restrict elevator use and movement.
Hello and welcome to ThePrint. This is Amrtansh Arora, and we are here in Tamil Nadu's Chennai. Data is the new oil, but until a few years ago, Indian data was being stored in Singapore. The push for data localization and data sovereignty has led to a data center boom in India, and Chennai is smack in the middle of it. Together, Mumbai and Chennai account for more than half of all operational data centers in India. Behind me is one such data center run by Equinix, which operates more than 200 data centers across the country. This one was inaugurated by Tamil Nadu Chief Minister M.K. Stalin just last year. Half of the project is operational and the other half is expected to be complete soon.
India is in the thick of a data center sowing season, with an early mover advantage for Mumbai, Chennai, Hyderabad, Visakhapatnam, and Pune. But Jonas Topp-Mugglestone, a London based researcher with telecoms consultancy STL Partners, argues that India isn't moving fast enough. Let's listen in. We are here with Jonas Topp-Mugglestone, a London based researcher who specializes in data centers. And he's also a consultant with STL Partners. Hi, Jonas. Thank you so much for taking out the time and talking to the print. Jonas, let's dive right into it. How do you see the data center boom around the world? When did this shift begin, and what do you think different countries who are major players in the sector, like the US, which has somewhere about 4,000 data centers, the UK, which is a distant second with about 500, in India with about 270, more or less. How do you see this boom around the world? When did it begin, and how do you think these major players are doing things differently?
Sure. So, data centers, what we have to understand, have been around for a while. The data center boom, though, is quite different. So, we've had data centers, obviously, for decades now. And the 2010s saw the rise of what we've called hyperscale size data centers, which are more around running cloud compute workloads, which in turn run a lot of the apps that we use in day to day life. What the 2020s have seen differently is the rise of what we've termed AI factories, which are large-scale AI data center facilities, which are dedicated to training and running AI workloads. And that obviously mainly rose into what we've called the ChatGPT moment. When ChatGPT got launched, everyone got very excited about that, and everyone has massively started building out data centers. So if we think about the global data center boom, it's being driven less by general internet growth and more by the rapid scaling of these AI workloads. And these AI workloads require significantly higher compute density and power capacity than those traditional cloud applications that I mentioned previously. So that's prompting this build out. So if we take a step back, data centers have power, and they power the applications on our phone, every app you'll use, be it Instagram, TikTok, etc. They power AI, you can use ChatGPT and other AI applications, and they obviously power economies ultimately. Many of the digital economies around the world are obviously powered by data centers. But they also use power, and by power in this context, I mean electricity. So globally, if we look back to 2024, data centers consumed around 1.5% of global electricity use. And that figure is expected to massively rise as AI adoption accelerates. And that's an issue which you mentioned a few markets there, the US and UK, they're already facing massive issues with that power consumption that data centers are prompting. In many mature markets, like you referenced the UK, the US, the limiting factor is no longer land or necessarily even capital. There's a lot of money being put into it, but power access, which includes grid connection timelines, transmission upgrades of the grid, and substation capacity and things like that around that. And several advanced economies have already encountered these growth constraints. which demonstrates that this boom, as we call it, isn't necessarily frictionless. In Ireland, if we look at Ireland, for example, data centres have grown to consume around 21% of national electricity, which has triggered quite significant political debate and in turn tightened grid connection oversight. And there's several other examples. You can look at Singapore, Netherlands, where similar things happened. So that means that this boom is quite real, and it is going to, I think, last a significant time. There's a lot of money going into it.
So, Jonas, like you told us that the AI era that the world is entering, or that's leading to the boom in data centers, where do you see India in this larger picture? What do you think India is doing right? What do you think India is doing wrong? And what do you think India is doing differently in terms of regulation or in terms of incentives that data center operators are getting here? So, what's your take on that?
Sure. So I think, as you mentioned, I think the Indian market is very interesting, coming from a very going into a very exciting era of the Indian data center market. But I think when we take into account the Indian data center boom, which by all accounts, as you mentioned, is very significant, it's important to understand India's starting point in this context. So what I mean by that is India has historically under-indexed on data center capacity relative to its quite considerable digital scale. So if we take into account hard numbers, India's installed data center capacity is roughly around the 1.5 gigawatt mark, which seems like a vast amount of power draw. And just for context, we usually measure data center size and of a market size in power. And so 1.5 gigawatts on the surface seems like a vast number. But if we take that into comparison with other markets, let's say, for instance, Europe. In Europe, data center capacity across major markets, if we think about the UK, Germany, Netherlands, Ireland, and France, is roughly 10 to 12 gigawatts. So if we compare the two, that means India today has around 1/10 of Europe's capacity in data centers. So that mismatch is quite striking because India has a larger population. It's one of the fastest growing digital markets globally. It's the fourth largest economy in the world, and it has rapidly expanding AI workloads and digital public infrastructure, which we can speak to later. But really, what we're thinking about here is, it's a game of playing catch up for India in some respects. The current boom shouldn't really be read in the same lines as speculative AI hype as we see in other markets. In some ways, it's much more structural, much more durable than that, I would say. It is, in many ways, a structural catch-up. So India is correcting historical underbuild of physical digital infrastructure. And for years, obviously, India generated data, but hosted relatively little of the infrastructure needed to process it at scale. And now that gap is getting addressed by this specific Indian data center boom. So that explains why hyperscaler investment numbers are so large. In some ways, it's a safe investment because India has all the structural features to justify it as a large data center market, even when we disregard the vast amount of AI hype going on at the moment. And that explains why states in India are competing aggressively to be the locations for those data center hubs. And that's why policy, in terms of regulatory policy, has shifted around power access, land, renewables, and sustainability. So India isn't necessarily building excess capacity, it's closing more of a structural deficit in this domain. And that also means a positive of that, I think, for the Indian market is that there's less fear, as we're seeing in a lot of Western markets, about an AI bubble. In other markets, we talk around bubbles around data center investment, data center booms. But in India, it's far more structurally justified. It's a safer investment, and it makes sense as an economy to play this catch up because India is obviously, as we enter the 21st century and we're going towards the middle of the 21st century, it's clear India is going to be a real major power on the world stage, and it needs a digital backbone to really back that status, which is obviously what's being built at the moment.
As the SEZs of the AI age, data center clusters are positioning India as the second largest market in the Asia Pacific. Alphabet, Microsoft, Amazon, and Meta have together pledged over $40 billion just in the last 6 months to build or expand data center capacity in India. Experts like Jonas agree that the expansion of data center capacity must not come at the cost of sustainability. Data centers consume massive amounts of power and water. A single ChatGPT query, for instance, uses nearly 10 times as much electricity as a Google search. In industry parlance, the terms used to measure efficient usage are PUE and WUE, which stand for power and water usage effectiveness, respectively. Siddharth Sinha, says the data center boom must be accompanied by an auxiliary power grid and sustainable solutions that wouldn't worsen the situation in Indian cities already facing water stress. Let's listen in.
My first question to you is about the power usage that comes with the data center boom. In your opinion, what is the state of the national grid, and how do you see it with respect to the data center boom that we're seeing in India at this point?
Amrtansh, firstly, thank you for having me here. And I think this is a very topical conversation. So, many sort of my compliments because, you've sort of brought it to the forefront. I think, look, the compute capacity, sort of the compute demand in India is exploding as it is across the rest of the world. And I think it's important to understand sort of why this is happening. Even though we call it a boom, but it's happening for a number of reasons. One, of course, is which currently we store financial data in the country, but, not all other types of, data, but increasingly, with the DPDP rules as and when they keep coming into effect over time, more and more data will be stored in the country. But that's one aspect of it. The other aspect, of course, is the explosion of the generative AI sort of workloads. And India is a big consumer, as are most emerging economies. Almost 80 to 90% of the consumers of the Gen AI tools of the world actually are in emerging economies, and of which a vast chunk is in India. But almost 60 to 70% of the compute today actually is sort of concentrated in US and Europe. Plus also the fact that India has been moving and advocating quite vocally for sovereign AI, and rightly so. We've just emerged out of a global India impact, AI impact summit that we've had. But also we've got a very large coastline on which multiple sort of subsea cables can make landings. So we're also able to serve the broader region and not just India. So I think that overall it's a great opportunity for India. Now, insofar as the power grid is concerned, absolutely. I mean, people have a right to sort of think about how this really impacts power consumption. India, let's talk about the positives first. The positives are still the fact that in this entire country, we have a single grid. We have one grid. We have a unified grid. So it's one grid, one frequency, which operates at a single frequency. So there are positives to it. There has been a massive sort of expansion on the renewable, on the RE capacity front in India, right? So all of these are very good signs. But yes, you're absolutely right that a lot of sort of data centers which are coming up, they're sort of coming up in what I would call concentrated clusters. Now the general problem, so as to say, in India is that when your renewable energy injection into the grid, they actually start sort of increasing. What also ends up happening is that evacuating this from the grid actually becomes slightly tough. Now the problem is that when all of this happens in concentrated clusters, this becomes even tough. And so what really needs to be done, I feel, at this point, is that rather than seeing this as a massive challenge for the Indian grid, we should see this as an opportunity for basically, creating an entirely new sort of ancillary services market for the grid, which is essentially how do you stabilize the grid, how do you optimize the grid. More importantly, I think data centers are also an opportunity. Look at technology more broadly, right? And let me try to link the two of these together. When AI came in, people had fears that AI would be used to, launch cybersecurity attacks and so on. But the same AI today is also actually used to preempt cybersecurity strikes, in a very sort of accurate manner. I think the same thing is true for technology and even renewable energy more generally. That you might seem to think that it will take a lot amount of power, it will guzzle a lot of power, which is very true. But we should see actually this challenge as an opportunity to bring about changes to the national grid in India. I would say that should be centered around four different pillars. That any future data center demand in India should be met by additionality of renewable energy, which means that it should lead to sort of the co-location of renewable energy generation, or building new solar sites, building new wind sites, and so on. The second is, I believe that this will also give a big sort of push to the need for storage solutions in India. Now, battery storage is just one part of the solution. You see, you have to understand the challenge with the grid. Data centers are essentially, they're 24/7 guzzlers of power, right? So you think of it generally more at a very broader level. I mean, nuances aside, as a static load which is drawing that power constantly. So that means that in the day, sure, you may have solar, but solar will go away during the night. Wind is there, but wind also to a certain extent is intermittent. What is the remaining options are nuclear. Nuclear penetration in India is not very high. So what you need to do is you need to do storage. Now, batteries can store a large amount of power, but they cannot provide you the base load of power, right? So that is why it's very important to come up with, for example, gravity-based energy storage systems. That's what you would call pumped storage solutions. So in pumped storage, what essentially happens is that you take an upper reservoir, you take a lower reservoir. In the day when the renewable energy is in excess, you pump water from the lower reservoir to the upper reservoir, and you release it at night. So that gives you about 6 to 7 hours of so think of it as a gravity based battery. And there's a lot of innovation happening across the world today. There's a Swiss company called Energy Vault, which has actually created gravity based energy storage systems where cranes basically lift giant blocks of concrete and they slowly release them at night, generating energy. And their first commercial scale project is coming in China. So I actually see more data centers coming up as an opportunity to bring in pump storage in India, to create sort of green corridors in India, where data centers, they become sort of the anchor customers around, or anchor demand around which additional supply comes up. But storage becomes really, really important.
We've seen in Western media outlets, as well as many very credible outlets in India, have reported on this in quite some detail, that the power usage, that the water usage will go up significantly, because data centers require a lot of water, because the cooling systems that you need to keep the racks in which servers are stored cool, and that, if located in an area where the stress on the water table is very high, can have very, very disastrous consequences. In India, we've seen specifically, because in India's context, this also coincides with the fact that cities where data center clusters are coming up have already been identified as cities where groundwater levels are down, where the water table is whack out of balance. So how do you see that?
No, Amrtansh, again, this is a very valid question. We are seeing globally, sometimes data centers, they're consuming as much power as, as much water as, entire Olympic-sized swimming pools, which automatically becomes a cause of concern. So, for instance, there's many countries want to locate data centers in Chile, and Chile has been suffering from a prolonged drought now for very many years now. So automatically the question becomes, well, where is all the water going to come from? And is this going to exacerbate, is it going to worsen conditions, and is it going to change the status quo? So there's two, three things. I think the water consumption of a data center really depends on how smart your data center design is, right? So it really depends on which cooling technology you go for. If you go for air cooled data centers, you will be consuming much less water. If you go for very optimized cooling solutions, including you have techniques like direct to chip cooling today, like where the water gets delivered directly at the level of a chip. Google DeepMind, I used to work with Google before. Google DeepMind today has algorithms, AI based algorithms and solutions which actually optimize the water flow across the data center to an extent, and their AI technologies, and which is again sort of interesting, because a data center is essentially what's giving the world AI, but that same AI is also those AI solutions are also being used to optimize the water flow. So I would say that it is not that technologies do not exist, which can sort of reduce water flow, but which can sort of reduce the water consumption. But again, it depends on data center design and where the data centers are located. In many parts of the world, especially in the Nordic countries, it's very easy to cool down data centers because, well, they don't need to be cooled, and in some cases, you can just basically pump and seawater cool down the data centers, right? But again, in water stressed regions, the situation becomes different, as you rightly mentioned.
We were having a discussion about this, where you told me about so many great data center models that have been adopted around the world, where it's not just solving the computing demand problem, but it's also dealing with a couple of other issues. So how about you tell our viewers and readers a little more about these models from around the world, which we in India can look at as a reference point?
No, of course, Amrtansh. So I think I would again give you possibly 3 or 4 examples, and we looked at these examples, and what we feel is that again, like I said, with a comprehensive 360-degree approach, you could actually create a blueprint where all of this could very much happen in India as well. So one, of course, is the part about wastewater recycling, as you rightly mentioned, you're seeing it happen here in Tamil Nadu itself. So that in itself, I mean, you've given the viewers one example yourself, but then there is other, which I rightly mentioned. In Mexico, you've got data centers which are basically setting up wastewater treatment plants, and then they're sort of using the same water to cool down data centers. But then also there are super energy efficient data centers. Normally a data center, I'm sure you're aware of something called power usage effectiveness. A PUE actually tells you how efficient a data center is. So a data
Yes.
center that's really efficient would have a PUE of 1. So the more water and the more sort of energy you guzzle, the PUE starts going above 1, right? India, it's about 1.3, 1.4, but we have a real opportunity to bring it closer to 1.1 if we get everything else, sorted correctly. The other example would be, Google's data center in Finland, which is called the Hamina data center. Now, the Hamina data center, again, what they've been able to do is, they've used, Hamina used to be, I think it used to be an old paper mill at one point, and now they've converted it into a data center. But what they're also doing is that they're basically capturing the waste heat from the data center, and then they're actually using it to keep the entire town of Hamina warm. So that's a model which is known as district heating, for example. And the third part, of course, we said is that there are so many different renewable energy, clusters coming up in the world where data centers are sort of organically coming up alongside, additions to renewable energy. I mean, in Malaysia, you've got data centers where data centers are being built, but in parallel, co-located solar parks are being built as well, right? So the thing is that the broader idea was that, the India has its own set of advantages, right? India has its advantages because of the reasons we discussed right at the start. More and more companies want to come and build their data centers in India. But if you were to create a framework where new data centers in India that are being built are incentivized to recycle wastewater, and if they're located away from the tier one, tier two cities, then you're essentially coming up with what are known as climate co-benefits. That, in the process of building a data center, you've brought in economic and environmental benefits as well. So you've built a data center, and now a town or a village that did not have a wastewater treatment facility now has one. You build a data center in, let's say, the Himalayas. I mean, Ladakh, we were discussing this just yesterday. Ladakh, one of the world's highest green hydrogen filling stations is in Ladakh, and I see no reason why you could not use Ladakh, which has abundance in solar, combine it with sort of storage solutions, and build data centers, and then use the waste heat from those data centers to also provide heating to homes. And I believe that AI in that sense is a blessing in disguise, because while it will enable India to achieve its sovereign compute ambitions, at the same time it will also allow India to achieve a greater penetration of not just renewable energy, but clean energy, which is round the clock clean, which is hour by hour, second by second clean. So that I believe is the future for India.
Latest industry estimates put the number of data centers in India at over 270, up from 138 in 2022. For India, this is still the first 40 meters of a sprint. Early, but decisive.